Nem be akartam mondani, de jól tudom, aztán várok egy percet. Jó napot kívánok, üdvözlök mindenkit! A délutáni panelbeszélgetésünk, aminek a címe Háborúk, korszaka, Ukrajna, Irán és a következő front. Technikai jellegű megjegyzéssel kezdeném. A panelbeszélgetést angolul fogjuk lefolytatni, szóval akinek tolmácsgépre van szüksége, az most szerezzen magának egyet, és 1 perc múlva kezdünk. Azon az oldalon vannak a tolmácsgépek. I just told the guests that we will be conducting the discussion in English. Ladies and gentlemen, please take your seats. We will shortly begin. It is my distinct honor to welcome everyone to this panel discussion, which is going to focus on forever wars, Ukraine, Iran, and maybe the next front. Joining me in this discussion is Peter Sztáray, a security policy expert, former state secretary for security and energy policy. Anton Bendarzsevszkij, expert on the post-Soviet space and director of the Oeconomus Economic Research Foundation. Marek Matraszek, founder and president of CEC Group. And at last but not least, Professor Iulian Chifu, geopolitical analyst and president of the Conflict Prevention and Early Warning Center. Before we start talking about the specific anatomy of forever wars or forever conflicts, first I would like to start by the assessment of the happenings of the past year, both in the Ukraine-Russian war as well in the Middle East. A year ago, if I remember, Ukraine was not doing that great, and Russia seemed to be gaining on the battlefield, while at the same time the sustainability of the Ukrainian war effort was brought into question by the United States withdrawing some of its financial and military support from Ukraine. Now, a year on, the picture looks somewhat different. And I would like to ask first Marek to talk a little bit how he sees the happenings of the past year on the Ukrainian front.
2 or 3 years ago, every conference I attended, including, I'm sad to say, in Budapest, the message was, Ukraine cannot win. Russia cannot be stopped. It is useless to keep supporting this forever war. We should stop aiding Ukraine because the fight is lost, and we should come to a compromise with Russia. Even then it seemed hugely presumptive, especially as it assumed that it was not up to the Ukrainian people to decide when they should stop fighting. But today the situation is hugely different. I believe that Russia will lose this war. There is a question mark, of course, how we define losing, but what is now clear to me is Ukraine will not lose and Russia will not win. We're not quite there that Russia will. But many, many things have shifted, and in no particular order. I think the most fundamental miscalculation was a failure of actually all the actors initially, the United States, Europeans, and the Russians, to underestimate what I think we're going to be talking about a bit later, so I won't prejudge that conversation, is the resilience of the Ukrainian people. The best thing that Putin did was that he recreated the spirit of the Ukrainian people and the Ukrainian nation. Of course, it's a difficult story. It's fraying a little bit at the edges, but the resilience of the Ukrainian people has been a critical factor to explain why we are where we are today. The second thing that people got wrong, they thought, well, if Trump stops supplying weapons or stops giving permission for long-range strikes, Ukraine is finished. Without American weapons, this cannot succeed. Two things happened. First of all, again, to everyone's surprise, the Europeans stepped up in different ways. Poles, Germans, French, British, stepped up with arms deliveries, technology, and above all, an existential acceptance that Europe cannot allow Putin to succeed, because if he succeeds in Ukraine, Europe, understood as my country, the Baltic states, Romania, will be next. So there is, despite all the political differences in Europe, there is an existential consensus that there must be a defeat of Russia. So the supply of weapons, consistently, albeit unfortunately blocked often by Hungary, of sanctions packages. I see there's another sanctions package was approved today in Brussels despite Greek objections. So the pressure continues. And the third thing which people just did not understand was the huge superiority that Ukraine would develop in military technology. It turns out that with the right people in charge, the right attitude, you can develop new military technologies which have transformed the battlefield completely, hugely to Russia's disadvantage. And again, I might talk about that later. Fourthly, I talked about resilience in the case of the Ukrainian population. What we are now seeing over the last 6 months is a relatively rapid fragmentation of Russian internal domestic resilience. The tactics that the Ukraine has deployed in terms of long-range strikes into Russian refining and oil export terminals has had a dramatic effect on the ability of the Russian economy to function. And especially in Crimea, we've seen these queues of... Secondly, which nobody thought of, but actually remarkably has had a remarkable effect over the last 2 weeks, is the attack on the wild berries logistics hubs in Ukraine, which is Russia, which are the Russian version of Amazon warehouses. In the space of a week, Ukraine has brought the war home to the Russian people. This is no longer a faraway war in a country we know nothing of, and it does not even exist. This is a war that every Russian is now feeling. And suddenly, they are asking the question, why? Why? Why is this war happening, and why are we not winning? And Mr. Putin has no answer for these questions. I'll leave it there because the next challenge, which I think also Putin will fail, is after the elections and his inevitable attempt to mobilize the population. I'll leave that for later, but I think the general situation is dramatically different from what it was 2 years ago. And I genuinely think that Ukraine is going to win this war. And everyone who supported the view that Ukraine should capitulate in 2 years' time will have to take a very deep look in the mirror when they shave in the morning.
Thank you. Well, actually, I don't know about the conferences in Budapest writ large, but it was in October 2023 when we organized a one-day conference at the Danube Institute titled "Why Ukraine Needs to Win." Well, it's a shame that you didn't come to that one. But I'm going to turn now to Professor Chifu, and I would like to ask him to give us a similar assessment of how the situation looks in the Middle East. Again, how it looks like to me is that last year we had a limited military operation, a short one, Israeli-American military operation in Iran that has a clear start, a clear end, clear limited objectives. But this year, something else happened. And right now, I'm not sure if whatever is going on in Iran can be sold at home in front of an American audience as a clear-cut victory or sustaining any or reaching any kind of objectives which were set before the conflict. How do you see the difference?
Not very fancy and fashionable to discuss about Iran, but it affects all of us when the streets are blocked and when you see the price of oil raising, and the same happening with all the goods that are distributed. So it's of tremendous importance. What can I say about this type of war? Actually, it came from bad presupposition, bad assessments. As you know, it began by the objective of changing the regime and blocking the capacity of getting to the nuclear weapon. It had in the background the context of this beginning of the year riots on the streets coming from one of the parts who are usually supporting the regime of the Ayatollah, which is the bazaar, the little merchants, who as a sudden didn't cope with the differences between the official rate of exchange of the dollar and the real rate, and that put people going on the street with the repression coming from the Basij, from the militias of the regime. Well, that led to the assessment that once that action is prompted, people are going to take to the streets, are going to replace the regime, and they are going to do their own in order to move the right way. It has been expressed as such even by President Trump. And for sure, the third point is that after taking control of the skies, after destroying the nuclear capabilities, but also the drones and the missiles, including the production, the storages, and so on, Iran doesn't have capacity to defend itself. And as a consequence, it doesn't have cards. I'm also quoting President Trump. Well, guess what? Things prove to be in a different shape than the one that has been planned originally or expected. First and foremost, it was a plan. Ali Khamenei had a plan. The 85 years old Ayatollah had a plan. The supreme leader had a plan about what will happen after he is going to be killed. And the leadership of the most important institutions, the Artesh, the military, the Islamic Guard, all of those are destroyed. Then, okay, selectively, because the president, Pezeshkian, stand in place. The Minister of Foreign Affairs, who was supposed to be the next negotiator as the president of the parliament, Galibaf, were maintained because you need somebody to talk to and to sign at the end of the day a type of agreement who would look more as a complete concession to losing the war. But the plan looked, and it's a lesson learned for everybody, including for Ukraine in that sense, it has been planned that at the moment where the leadership is erased, the successor is going to be completely decentralized, including the military, which each unit having its own objective and fighting as long as they can until they are destroyed. That's why even if we had at some point some negotiations and some agreements, there were units who were continuing to strike, to shoot. The Gulf countries, in the Middle East, in Jordan, in Qatar, in Kuwait. Why? Because they had those plans from the beginning. So it was completely decentralized, and it was already changed the hierarchy with General Vahidi, the chief of the guards, the Islamic guard, who was making the linkage between the religious group of Qom. We know that it is Moshtaba Khamenei, but nobody saw him, that he's still alive in some type of shape, and that he's the one ruling the show. But in any case, the group of Qom is the religious who are leading the country, and the administration, the negotiators. So the Islamic Guard took over because they had this task of saving the regime. The administrators, the Minister of Foreign Affairs, all of those guys can do whatever they want. They can negotiate as long as they want, but they don't have to touch on the viability of the regime. So by making this decentralization and this pre-planned way of putting things, it proves that, yes, Iran has caught. Moreover, Americans proposed this MOU. You know very well, Memorandum of Understanding. It's not a peace process, but it covers more or less whatever the Iranian has asked for. It's the best deal that they could ever dream on. And that was why Trump, Rubio, all the other guys thought that Iranians are going to take it and to respect it. When there were problems, first, nuclear was postponed for 60 days to be negotiated. And what was related to the Hormuz, it was an ambiguous formulation in such a way, constructive ambiguity, to let them sign. And after that, we are dealing with it. Well, even if this memorandum of understanding was positive for the Iranians, they asked for more. And they asked for more for a very clear purpose. The deterrence antebellum, so the capacity of balancing and of being sure that they are not going to be harmed in the sense that the regime is not going to be changed, was referring to their capacity of reacting and of destroying. And they realized that the only security guarantee for the regime that they could get is the so-called sovereign control of the Hormuz Strait. And for them, at this point, that's the crucial point that they negotiate. It helps on two accounts. The first account is the fact that we are no longer discussing about the nuclear deal. Nobody's discussing, nobody put back on the table the original problem that they had, and they postponed for 60 days. So Iranians to give up the quantity of uranium 60% that they have still under their control. It's something 400 something kilos, 440 kilos. And at the same time, not ensuring that they are never going to enrich uranium in Iran. It has been forgotten because everybody is talking now only about Hormuz. Why? Because Hormuz creates a huge problem for the whole world. Donald Trump is saying, well, we don't care too much. We are not importing oil from the Gulf country. It's not for us. It's the European who should take care of the freedom of navigation. Well, it didn't work. It didn't work because at home, the prices of the oil are on the global market, and in spite of the fact that US has its own oil, the prices are the prices of the market. And it harms directly. It doubled the price of the gallon of oil. It increased the inflation inside US, and guess what? We do have elections, midterm elections. It doesn't look too good. So Iranians prove that they do have cards. Moreover, the idea of escalating, we are going to destroy the missile sites or the drone sites who are shooting on the vessels. We are going to put down and to sink whatever speedy vessels is attempting to reach one of the vessels that are passing via the Oman route. Well, in all those cases, we have seen another escalation, and the escalation is called Al-Houthi Yemen Bab el-Mandeb, the way of getting the oil afterwards via the Red Sea and the Suez Channel to Europe. So it's an other harm. It happened 2 days ago. For the moment, the Houthi didn't move the wrong way. We have just some hints that they shoot 2 of the Saudi Arabia vessels because they stick to their problem. We have a problem with Saudi Arabia. We are going to put down any vessel that comes with Saudi Arabian flag. So with this, that would make, the framework of where we are with Iran. It's very difficult to label it as forever war. Still, it's not Afghanistan, it's not Iraq, it's not something that will last. But in any case, at this point, I think that the Trump administration realized that they can not declare victory and leave anymore. At least after the NATO summit in Ankara, that's no longer possible to do so. So they like it or not, they broke the agreement, the JCPOA and whatever type of balances happened in the region. Now they own it. They need to fix it. Thank you.
Thank you. I've seen Anton scribbling a lot on that paper, so I hope that's not a to-do list for later, but more like reflections on the first 2 speakers. So I would like to ask you to give your take on these 2 conflicts, and then I will move on to the ambassador about the frictions it's caused on the transatlantic unity.
Thank you. It's a pleasure being here again at Tusványos. Let's hope that next year we'll have a similar panel as well. I will talk rather more about Ukraine because if I would talk about Iran as well, it would take too long. And you asked about the last year, but I will go a bit earlier, but I promise I will be short. I will start it on 2023. Because I think the structure of the war, what we see right now, was formed in that year. So at the beginning, in 2022, it was a war of quick gains. Russia wanted to take whole of Ukraine, change the government, make a puppet state. Didn't succeed. Ukraine wanted to regain all their territories, second half of 2022 and first half of 2023. It did not succeed, unfortunately. And after that, we are talking about the war of attrition. And basically what happened in the last year, and I'm coming to your question now, the narrative, the narrative of Russia about the attrition war, that Russia is stronger, it has bigger resources, the time works for Russia, this has changed. Because what we've seen since 2023, that Ukraine is not able to counterattack, it's not able to take back the initiative, that resources are, Ukraine has less and less resources, and Russia is gaining territories very slowly, but at a very speed which is quicker and quicker. And then it changed in 2026. So what Ukraine managed to do is to change that narrative of attrition war in which the time is working for Russia, because what we see in the last half year is that Russia is not gaining more territories. In fact, there were a few months when Ukraine took back more territories than Russia took territories of Ukraine. And Russia is experiencing problems with its economy, with military, with supply lines, and so on. So basically, this is the biggest change in the last 1 year, that the narrative of attrition war working for Russia has changed. But does it mean that Russia is losing the war? And I would maybe argue with Marek in that sense, also referring to the article of Valery Zaluzhny, the previous commander-in-chief of Ukrainian army. He had an article 2 or 3 weeks ago arguing about that question, is Russia losing? And he says no. So what we have to take in mind is that successes which Ukraine experiences right now at the battlefield doesn't mean that the other party is necessarily losing the war. The war is not linear, especially if it's a war of two parties with similar capabilities. The war is more like a roller coaster, or the war has waves. One wave is favoring one party, and then the other party can somehow adapt to it, find anything how to counter it, and then there is another wave where the other party is winning. So what we've seen in the previous years, there was a favorable wave for Russia. Now we see a favorable wave for Ukraine, but it doesn't mean that Russia won't be able to adapt and counter those capabilities, mainly in drone warfare and in technologies which Ukraine has right now. The question is, how long will it take for Russia to adapt? Because the longer it takes for Russia to adapt, then the more advantage Ukraine will have. So realistically assessing the situation, what we see on the battlefield right now, what Ukraine is capable of, Russia can do the same. So why Russia is not destroying Ukraine's critical infrastructure, like a petrol, what we see in Russia, because basically they already destroyed it, or most of it, before, mostly in the first year of the war. They are launching, unfortunately, hundreds of drones every day or every second day on Ukraine or Ukrainian capital. And we see rather an escalation on the battlefield where both of the parties are escalating not only through technology but through the quantity. More drones, more rockets, more missiles. And the only way the war will be stopped is through diplomacy. So I don't see how Russia will lose the war. I'd rather see a strategy, a capable strategy of Ukraine, how to force Russia to make a deal, to make a peace. And this is something which may work, and hopefully will work. But unfortunately, the I don't know if we will talk about peace. We had a favorable window of opportunity to close the war. I think it was beginning of this year. It passed. So probably the next window of opportunity will be next year, beginning of next year. Spring next year, probably. Yeah. So.
Without trying to split hairs here, both you and Marek were talking about winning and losing. So when we talk about Russia losing, what does that mean? Like, it means, for me, it would mean that they wouldn't achieve the objectives that they launched this invasion for, which was not to get a bunch of land in the Donbass, but to actually get rid of the democratically elected Ukrainian government and install some kind of puppet regime. So if they cannot achieve that, that already means in a sense that they've lost, or do we mean Russia losing is that Putin's head is on a lamppost and we have NATO flags atop the Kremlin? So what's losing here? What's losing here?
Of course, that's the main question. How do you define winning and losing? And Russia has not articulated their goals. What is winning? At the beginning of the war, Putin...
So Iran?
Yeah, well, that's deliberate. And what Putin said, that they have to demilitarize and denazificate Ukraine. What does it mean? Well, did they demilitarize Ukraine? No, Ukraine's army is better and has more experience, more capabilities. Did they denazify? What does it mean? I mean, it's a political term, but as analysts, we can define probably for Russia what does it mean to lose the war, and losing the war is not reaching those minimal goals which probably the Putin had in mind, and that's taking Donbass region. I think that's the minimum what he can communicate as a victory. If they won't be able to reach it, let's say if the war stops right now at the current front lines, it means Russia has taken 19% of Ukraine. Does it mean Russia won? No, it's not a victory. But I wouldn't call it a defeat either, but it's clearly not a victory. For Ukraine, what does it mean that they win the war or they lose the war? Did they, if the war stops right now at the current front lines, did they lose the war? No, they managed to keep their sovereignty, their independence. So did they win? No, probably they did not win, because they lost territories, they lost 200,000 or 300,000 people. So it's very hard to define. It's all about communication. How will you communicate? Because in the end, Russia will probably communicate that they won, and Ukraine will also communicate that they won too. So,
Marek, what's winning and losing for you quickly? Just in a few words.
This is a fascinating point of the discussion because this defines how history will judge Ukraine and Russia as who won, who lost. I agree with you that it's a very complicated answer. The very short term, any ceasefire along the current line of contact is a massive defeat for Putin, because in that moment he will have failed to have secured his war aim, which was the genocide of the Ukrainian people, because that is his goal. That was always his goal, is the genocide of the Ukrainian population. That's what he means by denazification, as well as the vassalization of the Ukraine as such. So he will have failed. The question of whether he has won or lost will really be decided what comes after. Because paradoxically, that is the most dangerous moment for the West, is a ceasefire. Because at that moment, there will be a great deal of problem in maintaining Western unity and what to do towards Russia. NATO and the European Union will fracture internally about the future policy towards Russia. Is it direct military containment of putting Western troops into Russia, into Ukraine as peacekeepers to control the ceasefire line? Or do we allow Putin to use this pause in the conflict? Because for Putin, this will not be the end of the conflict. It will be a pause in the conflict to regroup, to reindustrialize, to rearm, and to move further into Ukraine or possibly against the Baltic states or Poland. Because this, what we have to understand is that from the Russian perspective, this is an imperial war. So if you ask me what is a Russian defeat is the end of the imperial war mentality in the minds of the Russian leadership and in large parts of the Russian population. That requires the loss of Crimea. This started from Crimea in 2014 with the Little Green Men. This war has to end in Crimea with the evacuation from the Crimean Peninsula of Russian troops, as well as the Russian migrants who came into Crimea after 2014 using fake citizenship and so on. That loss of Crimea has to happen for a slow collapse of the Russian imperial mentality. Only when that Russian imperial mentality collapses can you talk about a real peace in Europe. Without that shift, nothing will change. Now, the only final point is, things happen when wars end. Regimes change, leadership changes. If the war ends in a ceasefire, and at the same time Putin is toppled in the Kremlin, that opening of political uncertainty in Russia itself is a huge opportunity, because at that moment you can have all sorts of discussions about the framework of a future bilateral alignment. But you ask me what is the real victory for the West against Russia and what is the real loss of Russia against the West? It's the end of the Russian imperial mentality, and that will take decades, not weeks or months.
Thank you. You mentioned, Marek, that it would be difficult maintaining Western unity if there is a ceasefire. Now, that's specifically what I would like to continue talking about, and I will ask Ambassador Sztáray to open the stage for us on Western unity itself. Because if you look at these two conflicts, the United States, which is the leader of the Western alliance of NATO, has diverged from Europe in both conflicts. First, in the case of Ukraine, it was, at least it seemed manageable, but when it came to Iran, it turned into an open fracture. I'm talking about the fact that a number of NATO allies just refused to allow the American Air Force to use their bases, for example, Spain, while the war was ongoing in Iran, and they refused to commit naval assets to opening up the Strait of Hormuz. But at the same time, France and Britain launched their own maritime mission for securing opening the Strait of Hormuz. So what's the level of pressure on the transatlantic alliance now? Why do we have such kind of fractures if on the other side it's pretty clear how Russia, Iran, China, and to a lesser degree North Korea are cooperating and helping each other?
Yeah, thank you, and thanks for the invitation, first of all. If you allow me a couple of remarks with regard to the odds and the possible outcome of the war. I'm more pessimistic with regard to Ukraine's possible win because of several reasons. I think still in terms of resources and in terms of military hardware, Russia is better off. The Ukrainians have shown a fantastic level of resilience, I agree, and they have shown an unimaginable level of technical development in the past few years with regard to modern military technology, especially on the drones. But the Russians are always catching up after there's a win on the side of the Ukrainians. I see a serious manpower problem on the Ukrainian side, and I see a very, very strong Russian political commitment, because this is a strategic war for Russia, and strategic is maybe an understatement. They want to maintain influence, like he said, strategic influence on the foreign policy orientation of Ukraine and of the post-Soviet republics, except the 3 Baltic states, and they won't give up on this. So I don't think that anyone can win this war, neither Russia nor Ukraine. I don't think that it's possible to win back the territories. But on the other hand, there's a very good chance for Ukraine that maybe with a smaller size, but it will be able to stick for the long run to the Western alliance and to the European Union. I think this is where we are, and in this situation, when there's no good solution, I would still argue for some kind of support for the Trumpian approach, that we have to take the Russians as a legitimate negotiating partner, because otherwise there will be no end to this war. And I think that's the major difference, and there I come to the transatlantic rift, or the transatlantic divisions. President Trump, unlike his predecessor, he made a heroic attempt to bring the parties to the table and to reach some kind of compromise, if one can call it compromise, but still to some kind of agreement on a ceasefire. Now, he didn't get a wholehearted support from the Europeans, because the Europeans do not take President Putin and the Russian leadership as a legitimate partner, and from that point on, they don't see any real chance for a long-term agreement. And that's the big question, how this can be developed in the future, whether there will be any further appetite on the side of the American administration, and how much the war will bring the parties to some kind of more realistic approach, that they both have an interest in ending the fighting and starting some kind of new chapter. I also agree that after signing a ceasefire, there will be further very serious questions. I don't really think that the Russians have an appetite or an ambition to move further militarily and take the Baltic states, go to Budapest or Berlin. I don't think that this is Russia's strategic aim. But they may have an interest in handling the question of Transnistria, for example. Nobody speaks about it today, but there's no Russian land access to Transnistria, and Russia tries to keep under control Moldova and Moldova's foreign policy through the Transnistrian problem. So I don't think that the Russians can give up on these aspects for the future, and that's why I'm very, very pessimistic with regard to the outcome of this war. Because even if they can agree some kind of ceasefire or some kind of technical agreement, Ukraine cannot accept giving up on territory, and Russia cannot give up on handing the upper hand and maintaining influence with regard to Ukraine's foreign policy and with regard to Moldova, actually. This is the big question. I don't have the crystal ball to tell you what will be the end game and how long this will last. With the present Western strategy, I mean, supporting Ukraine at a level which is only sufficient to slow down the Russian advances, but at the same time not giving a strategic support through which Ukraine would have the capacity to change the direction of this war. With this level of Western support, I don't think that the Ukrainians will be able to push back the Russians. And Russia has the support from China, from others, which we don't know too much about, but we know that it is sufficient for Russia to maintain this level of ambition. On the transatlantic division, there are several aspects of this. One is, of course, the burden sharing question. We saw the NATO summit 2 weeks ago, where there was a seemingly good mood, with some exceptions, with some statements, but at the end of the day, everybody supported the previous decisions to maintain the European ambition and to raise the level of spending to 5% in 10 years. And on the second day, President Trump was in a good mood. I think he made some positive statements. So there was no total disaster, which was the major aim of the European participants to avoid that. On Iran, of course, President Trump thinks that NATO allies have to participate in any American military campaign, which is decided in Washington. Europeans have a different view on that, and NATO is not for this purpose. NATO is for collective defense, which is very well defined, actually. But President Trump is well, astonished on the one hand and disappointed on the other hand with regard to many European allies, and this doesn't sound good for the future of transatlantic unity. At the end of the day, I think that even President Trump knows that he needs the strategic depth of NATO, the Atlantic and the European continent, and the Europeans know that they need the US presence in Europe, because otherwise they don't have the capabilities militarily to deter any kind of threat coming from any direction. So in that respect, both sides have the mutual interest for the long run to continue NATO with more European spending on defense, but at the same time with keeping politically the Americans in. So on that, I'm optimistic.
First, Professor Chifu wanted to add something, and then Marek.
Thank you very much. First, I need to for the record, to tell you that I'm a member of the Strategic Advisory Group of the President of Ukraine, so I quite know what's on the ground. I'm Romanian, and as you know, former Romanian official. So there are some dramatic changes in what is related to Ukraine. They are irreversible at this point. And besides the fact that we can't say that this could lead to the breaking or the implosion of Russia and the victory of Ukraine, we have all the ingredients to show us that that's a possibility, a high possibility in the foreseeable future. It wouldn't last until next spring. What are the changes? Ukraine has now the most important army in Europe, 1 million soldiers under arms, and used to fight a war, a 21st century war. It's actually the first 21st century war that we are witnessing, full-scale, high-intensity, long-term war. And it has built up a level of resilience that is not much with any other Central European state. The second point, it's an army who learn to use and fight with all the weapons that not only Europeans, American, I don't know, Israeli, but also South Korean, Japan, global partners, if you want, have offered to him. They learn how to use it, they integrate, including in the anti-ballistic and in the anti-drones systems, and it doesn't match anything that we have at this point. Third point, they have built up what we called an ecosystem, including NGOs, private companies, reflection, research and design, and so on, who are directly linked to the units on the first line. It means that the cycle of change, of adaptation and of improvisation is shorter. For instance, we are speaking about drones, it's a label. The level of change is 2 to 3 weeks. You need to, because meanwhile, the Russians are learning, they are preparing their own systems, so electronic warfare, frequencies, guided telecommunications, and so on, are adapting each and every 2 to 3 weeks. Moreover, everybody producing new technologies are going to check on the viability on the Ukrainian front with everything that they have. It helps in two accounts. First, to see how good is the weapon. Second, to prove to the others that it's worth acquiring it. The things that happened with the NATO summit, and I have been there, is twofold. First, Ukraine has money. The 70 billion each year for this year and for the next year. Besides this money, Ukraine has money because it developed and it put on the ground already in the Gulf countries the anti-drone capabilities. which are electronic warfare, and the drone anti-drones that are run by AI. Why is it important? Because actually Ukraine is the only country who has trained its AI because of the hundreds of drones each evening hitting in Ukraine. So they are the only one who train their AI in real conditions of war. They have agreements now with 14 countries in the Gulf and Middle East and with numerous countries in the world with common investments, with transfer of technology, and at this point, the capacity of turning that back is practically nil. Moreover, as you have realized in Ankara, I was mentioning Ankara summit, they also are a part, for the first time, in anti-ballistic missile system of European Union, of Europeans, not European Union, of the Europeans. They are also, at the same time, a part of the deep strike missile program, German originally program. So at this point, they are on the way of acquiring, besides what they develop themselves, their own industry, capabilities that are not matched at this point by anybody. Even in the case of the Patriots, Patriots have limits, HIMARS have limits. The new types of development of missiles developed by Ukraine, and the same with the drones, are not matching anything that exists at this point. Yes, Russia comes after that, tries to compete, to reinvent, but they are lagging behind on two accounts. First, money. Second, technology. Russia, because of the sanction, has been cut off from the real technology. We were talking here, and I think Ambassador Sztáray mentioned this, that China is helping. China is helping as long as the transfer of technology is not hurting its own companies. Meaning that each time when pieces of electronics from China are discovered in drones or other capabilities on Ukrainian soil, there is an exchange of intel between Washington and Beijing, and the whole linkage or channel is cut off. Because China itself is in a position that they can't lose neither the American, neither the European market. And also the alignment that you can see nowadays between US and Europe on Ukraine is actually the final argument that shows you that now, by cutting the supplies of oil, by sinking everything that needs to arrive in Crimea in the occupied territory, there is a high pressure. By the way, the project, the strategy of Ukraine to getting out of the war is the 40 days of hell we are in that are cutting off every supply from the occupied territory. We are there. Is it going to work? I don't know if there is enough strategic way to do so. But all the ingredients, people coming from the war, possible new mobilization after the elections of the Duma, economic problems inside Russia are leading us to the possibility of, once again, the implosion of Russia, which is high.
Okay, thank you. Marek would also wanted to make some points here, and then we are moving on to our next topic. And then Anton, okay.
I think we're grasping for what will be the point of inflection, the pivot point for any dramatic resolution, whether it's a ceasefire or peace or surrender or whatever in Ukraine. What is the pivot? One of the key inflection points is Putin. This is Putin's war, but it's a war. It's his war in two senses. Number one, it's an imperial war, which he has decided to launch. Infected by the imperialistic ideas of Dugin and all these other people. But it's also an imperial war of Putin himself as an individual. He compares himself to Peter the Great. He wants to go down in history as the Russian leader who reconstructed Ruski Mir, Russia, the Russian world, around religion, around territory, around nationality. He has failed miserably. Look at what has happened under the last 5 years of this war, which is not just a war on Ukrainian territory, but is part of a broader imperial outreach of Russia. He has consolidated Europe. When he started this war, he thought Europeans would start jumping at each other's throats about the future of the war. He's consolidated European leadership about the need to defeat Putin. He has expanded NATO. He added Sweden, he added Finland, he brought Turkey back into the orbit because of the relationship with the United States. He has generated a situation where every NATO country is heading towards spending 5% of GDP on defense procurements. He has succeeded, together with Trump, in doing what nobody ever expected, was to have a revitalized, reindustrialized, more consolidated defense industry and a hugely armed Europe. And to go back to what Iulian said, effectively the honorary member of NATO, which is Ukraine, with 1 million men, and now performing essentially the frontline battle function for Ukraine. Under his watch, Russia is internally increasingly impoverished, its population facing a collapse in living standards. The war has come home to roost, as they say, because of the energy crisis, which is now, and the logistics crisis, which every Russian is now experiencing. Moreover, in terms of China, he has succeeded, he is halfway to the complete vassalization of Russia to China because of the increasing dependence of Russia on potential Chinese technologies, energy sales, pipelines. All of these factors are now have put China in a controlling position towards Russia. And in other theaters of globally, he has seen the crumbling of Venezuela. He has seen his ally in Iran dramatically weakened by the US administration. Strong signals that the next domino in the eyes, in the target of Trump, Rubio, and Hegseth is Cuba, which, if it goes, will be a strategic loss for Russia in the Western Hemisphere. And his major miscalculation, he really thought Trump would come to his rescue. Trump, the moment he has seen the direction of history moving, he moves with it. He had Zelensky, meeting Zelensky in Ankara, saying, I'm going to sell you the license to manufacture Patriot missiles. That's huge. So from every single perspective, Putin has failed. He has failed himself, he has failed Russia, he has failed his Russian people, he has failed the promises of being an emperor who is an empire builder. He is a pygmy who has led to the impoverishment, destruction, and strategic collapse of the Russian global position in relation to Europe, NATO, United States, and to China. At some point, very soon, I hope, there will be enough critical mass around Putin to get rid of him, whether it's through a bullet in the back of the head or some sanitized coup or some removal. His position, given the current trajectory of all these vectors, this correlation of forces, is unsustainable for him. I think the spark will be the attempt to mobilize the Russian people and introduce forced mobilization after the Duma elections, we'll see. But if he goes, everything, the game is on. And it then was really up to us in the West, in NATO, the European Union, the United States, to push this to a conclusion. But this will end when Putin ends, and I think his end is near.
I'd like to ask Anton to give his thoughts on what both Marek and the professor said, and then I would like to ask the next question from the ambassador. Go ahead.
I have some argument in the sake of argument. It's quite hard for me to to be in this position in a devil's advocate, because usually in Hungarian media in the last years I was arguing with those who were telling that Zelensky will be subject of a coup and Putin will win, and yeah, Ukraine will collapse and the Russian army will march in Kiev and so on. But I think it's important to stay on a realistic ground as much as I want Ukraine to survive and to succeed. So just making three main questions or arguments, what was told earlier. One question is finance of Ukraine. Now, yes, the situation was resolved. It was quite hard end of last year to get the financing for Ukraine, but they got it. But in the NATO document, which was signed in Ankara a few weeks ago, the $70 billion, it's nothing new, right? It's the money which was promised on bilateral or on EU level before. So what will happen next year? Yes, there are promises about another 70 million or at least 70 million. We will see. Billion. Second question, what if Russia will mobilize? We touched this topic. After parliamentary elections, I think it's quite high chance that Russia may mobilize again. And then right now, because of the technological advancement of Ukraine and drone warfare, we don't really feel the difference in manpower on the battlefield. But what will happen if Russia will be able to mobilize 200,000-300,000 people more, or 500,000? Yes. And third question, and the third question, I think that's the most important question: what will happen in winter? Because as the war in Iran continues, the stockpile of Patriot missiles and other air missiles is depleted, and Ukraine will be in very hard situation, I think. We'll see what will happen, but I think that's the main mistake in the last years was that the peace was not pushed by Ukraine and by the West in the beginning of 2023. I argued in the last years a lot that in Istanbul, beginning of 2022, it was not realistic to sign the peace on the conditions which Russia offered. It would have meant the end of Ukrainian sovereignty. But beginning of 2023, when Ukraine was having success on the battlefield, they managed to get a quite successful counterattack, and then they were getting a lot of weapons from the West, preparing the next counterattack in 2023. I think that was the right time to push for peace, because Russia and Putin was really in the condition of fear or of uncertainty. And now we have maybe not a very similar situation, but a situation when, again, there is a ray of hope for Ukraine. Putin's system is in big uncertainty because of economic condition, military condition. So I think that now would be the time to push for peace, and I'm really afraid that we will lose this opportunity.
Ambassador, I would like to ask you this question. What about political support? What about how much these wars, both Iran and Ukraine, is costing us in a sense of voter perception, in a sense that the people who actually vote in and out governments of power would just say that this is just too expensive. We had enough of it. How much of the present level of support is maintainable in Europe? And another question, do authoritarian regimes are better suited to fight out these kind of wars of attritions, specifically because they are less tied to public opinion? Now, I know that Putin is also tied to public opinion, like he cannot have a mass mobilization before the election. I understand that, but still he is kind of less directly tied to it as Western-style democracies are. So what are your thoughts on this?
Question, I would start with that. I don't think that authoritarian regimes have an advantage in respect of fighting any war. And it's clear if you look back in history, usually it doesn't help if you're authoritarian because you are not sufficiently flexible in adapting yourself to the situation, in adapting yourself to technological development and so on and so forth. But of course there are exceptions too, or other examples, like, I mean, Stalin fought the war together with its Western allies, together with China, and not at the beginning of this war, but in the second half, I think with quite some efficiency at the level of the given historical time. So there's no clear answer, but basically the way how the Ukrainians have, for example, accelerated the cycle of invention and of development of their technological gear, that's a proof that they are very capable of adapting themselves to the new situation. And the second question is political here. How much a society supports the strategic goals of the given leadership, and that doesn't depend on whether it's a more authoritarian or less authoritarian, because I think Putin's imperial appetite or imperial strategic interest in Ukraine is supported by very many Russians, because historically they believe that this is a part of the great Russia, the great Russian Empire. It's part of their history, and that's why President Putin was able to maintain such a broad level of support until now. We will see what happens at the elections this September, of course, but I don't believe in those judgments which say that now Putin has to look into his backyard because he's in danger, because Russian society and the Russian elites are moving away. But we'll see. And the first question was about
maintaining this level of political support.
Yeah.
The question being is not because when we talk about specifically, I've heard this argument many times when we talk about the war in Ukraine. Oh, what if the Russians send 5 million people in one side of the argument? On the other side of the argument, oh, if we combine all the GDPs of NATO, then we get like 15 times more than Russia or something like that. But it doesn't change the fact that this is not the Second World War. This is not a total war. Maybe it's close to a total war for Ukraine itself, but neither Russia or the collective West is perceiving this conflict as a total war. So the question is, how much are we willing to put into this war effort, not necessarily how much we can?
I think European societies are not very sensitive on this war, not anymore. On the one hand, they got used to it. On the other, they don't believe that this is a direct threat on them. And until they don't feel that this is a direct threat, until that time, I don't think that they will vote according to these lines. On the other hand, if you look at the Hungarian elections, it's interesting that the government campaign was about the threat and the danger of the war in our neighborhood. And actually, most of the voters did not too much care about it, especially young people. They don't feel that there is a direct threat. Maybe it's different in Poland or in the Baltic states, yes. But in Western Europe, I don't think that the average citizen votes along the lines how much, for example, the French government supports President Zelensky, or how much the German government argues for direct peace talks. We will see what happens, because the present financial support for Ukraine has, of course, some impact on the way how voters think. If they have social problems, maybe they will be more sensitive, and they will say, let's not give this support because there's no direct threat to the Ukrainians, but let's use it at home. That may have an impact. But until now, I have not detected a real picture about how the people are voting on the lines of how they judge a given government's approach to the war in Ukraine.
Just let me ask one part of the questions a little bit inversely. How about voting, like still having Ukraine factored into your voter intentions, but in a populist way, meaning that well, the economy is doing bad, inflation is high, I feel that I'm getting poor, and I'm going to vote to this populist party who says that well, the whole country is going to do much better, and my personal level of life is going to get much better just because I'm not going to be sending this much money to Ukraine. Because that argument, I think, is also spreading, especially in Western Europe.
I hinted at this aspect, that this may have an impact on the voter behavior, but has this had a decisive factor in the past few elections? I'm not sure. I couldn't detect it. Maybe in the future we will have some very important elections, actually, and if the war in Ukraine will be thematized, then we may have a better picture about this. But for the time being, I haven't seen any decisive factor in that respect.
Thank you. Any quick final thoughts to that? Because I still want to allow the audience to ask questions. So really just quick remarks, Marek and Professor Chifu, and then I want to open it up to audience questions.
Because it raises the issue of asymmetric warfare which Russia is pursuing. So the kind of narratives that you were talking about, I haven't seen it. It's not a popular narrative in the among Western politicians, but it's very much a narrative that's being pushed out by Russian bots on social media. Russia is exploiting what is the strength of the West, which is free speech and openness of information, to use that information space to conduct extraordinarily sophisticated psychological warfare within NATO amongst our population. So fomenting anti-Ukrainian sentiment, stuff about living standards. I don't go into other areas where Russian bots are very active in fomenting other axes of division within Western polities in order to foment dissatisfaction with elites. This is all part of a broader Russian psychological warfare operation, which is combined with other active measures such as sabotage, economic warfare, cyber warfare, covert and overt assassinations, strange fires in warehouses in Poland, for example, blowing up, trying to blow up aeroplanes or trains. This is all happening. And that is all being done in order to both disarm, confuse and obfuscate popular opinion, to make popular opinion more suspicious of elites and therefore more susceptible to populist parties who may be more pro-Russian than the current liberal establishment. So that's where the real danger is coming from.
As short as possible, a few ideas. Mobilization. If the results of the Duma are looking as the polls are looking now, we will have a government made by the so-called systemic opposition, and that's a big loss for Putin. Irina Russia is somewhere 20+% at this moment, and the consequences of the lack of oil and all the other things are not yet in the bank. The second point, you see what happened with the tanks and armored vehicles. Remember when we were saying, look how many tanks Russia has. They are going to invade. There's nobody who can sit in front of them. Numbers do not count in the 21st century. But brains, adaptation, creativity, innovation, that's the new soldiers of the 21st century wars. Then, we like it or not, and that's a historical view, the change of the world order comes always with a war. We are trying to avoid a direct, full-scale war. That's why everything moves more on the full-spectrum warfare, using more all the other instruments except the kinetic war, which is used only in the places where you can't do it with the other instruments. So this change prompts everybody to look more attentively, and acceptance of 3.5 plus 1.5, the 5.5, came 5% comes specifically from that point. Moreover, once we have the very clear message that US retreats from Europe, there is a reassessment in Europe. Who takes over? France says, well, I'm the permanent member of Security Council, I have the nuclear, I should be the head of the security and defense, and Germany should be the economic to give me the money to do whatever I need. Guess what? After the Zeitenwende, Germany says, we are building the army to defend Europe, the whole Europe. Now we are in a process of getting to 3.5% of the GDP of Germany inside Germany. How this is going to work with France and Poland and the security dilemma and reassessment, we are going to see. But for the moment, there is a full support of, in this reassessment, of putting money into the defense, of doing deterrence because you have the capabilities, and you can see on, for instance, the fight, who's doing the anti-ballistic defense of Europe, who's doing the deep strike capabilities of Europe. And that would actually end my intervention at this point.
So we have time for one question because we need to end at 5 sharp. Otherwise, the organizers kill me. Any questions from the audience? Well, it seemed that we just finished the perfect panel because everyone is going to leave here completely satisfied. We've covered everything, and now we can have world peace and end to Russian imperialism. A big round of applause to our panelists. Much for coming to the festival and for the stimulating discussion today. Thank you.